Good afternoon and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland and this week's Feel Scottish. My name is Grant Thoms, and with me this afternoon I have Keith Brown, MSP for the constituency in which we are sitting at the moment, Dunblane and Clacton, and of course Deputy Leader of the Scottish National Party. Good afternoon, Keith.
Good afternoon.
And with us we have William Duguid, who is a prolific political blogger, shall we say, over the
somewhat less prolific, not very prolific at the moment.
It's good to have you nonetheless, William. Obviously, the week has been interesting in so many different ways, but we'll start off looking at, in particular, our usual update on what's happening in the Middle East. So, since October last year, 1,262 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, and that's when the ceasefire started, bringing the total number of Palestinians killed in Gaza since October the 7th, 2023 to 73,391. Meanwhile, in southern Lebanon, which has witnessed some of the deadliest violence since the June ceasefire framework, overnight airstrikes targeting the towns of Anzar and Deir al-Sarani resulted in at least 11 fatalities, including several children. The Israeli military stated the strikes were launched in response to security threats within the border zone. Meanwhile, Hezbollah has strongly condemned the action, warning Beirut against relying on international mediation and threatening an appropriate response if Israeli military operations continue. Turning to the Gulf, maritime security remains under severe strain. The United Arab Emirates has formally blamed Iran for a targeted projectile strike on an oil tanker operated by Abu Dhabi's state-owned energy company ADNOC, while it was transiting through the vital Straits of Hormuz. Indirect negotiations mediated by Oman have faced significant roadblocks. Tensions have been further inflamed internationally following political remarks from Washington regarding the strategic waterway, while Tehran insists the channel will remain under Iranian jurisdiction. President Donald Trump has been questioned by journalists on numerous occasions this week about whether he is endorsing Israeli Premier Benjamin Netanyahu in the forthcoming Israeli general election in October, and notably has refused to do so. Significantly, he's referred to Netanyahu as a great wartime leader, but does that indicate that Trump would prefer a new peacetime leader? If I can turn to you, Keith, why do you think President Trump is reticent in signalling support to Netanyahu?
Well, of course, it's very hard to read the mind of President Donald Trump, but I think what you just said maybe equates to something like the truth, which is that even for Trump, it has gone on so long, it's so egregious, the distress amongst people in the Middle East because of Gaza, because of Lebanon, and now because of the Iranian war is just horrendous to behold for us, and we're not the ones experiencing it. And he himself probably wants to get onto other agendas. He's got the forthcoming midterms to try and deal with, so it may well be. And also we've seen signs of strains, of course, between him and Netanyahu. It's possibly something you won't see much progress on, unfortunately, until after the elections in Israel, and that may settle some of the issues. But we really do have to see a period of peace and stability, particularly in Gaza and in Lebanon. The people have suffered so much there, and we saw some evidence this week that there were some green shoots in terms of people, despite the horrendous conditions, starting to get involved in cyber enterprise again and things like that. And that's what we want to see. We have to see a stop to the killing. And I think it may be we have to await the outcome of the Israeli elections before we start to see further progress.
William, do you think that that forthcoming general election in Israel is basically going to put all attempts at further peace basically on the back burner while we await the outcome of how Israel will decide who's going to govern themselves?
I think there won't be any sort of permanent solution until after the election is over. Of course, Netanyahu may be under some pressure with regard to keeping his position. And of course, he has a corruption trial potentially in the background to be thinking of. So he'll be focusing very much on that. And I suspect it is possible that Donald Trump is indeed beginning to find that the bloodletting is too much even for him. But I also have a feeling that Trump just likes to be the master manipulator and deal maker, and he's putting a wee bit of pressure on Netanyahu to be a bit more open to the Board of Peace's presentation and their idea of how Gaza should go after this is over, the way forward, so to speak, although not a particularly attractive way forward for the Palestinians, I should think. So I agree with Keith. I really don't think there's going to be much in the next couple of months until that big date of 27th of October, and we see what happens in Israel. And then it may be a whole new picture. Who can say?
Watch this space, literally. Turning to the Ukraine, it's day 1635 in the since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. Over the past week, we've seen the Russia-Ukraine war intensifying in terms of long-range exchanges. Kyiv has reported localized counter-offensive gains in the south, while launching deep drone strikes targeting Russian industrial and naval infrastructure. Meanwhile, heavy aerial bombardments continued to batter Ukrainian urban centers and energy networks, surrounding compounding the severe humanitarian toll that's taken place in that war. Keith, you have a very keen interest in the Ukraine as someone who has hosted a Ukrainian family whilst they were seeking refuge. How would you sum up the current state of play in this conflict so far?
Well, it's reached, I suppose, dispassionately, a very interesting stage with the incredible resilience of the Ukrainian armed forces and people, and some of the innovative ways in which they, as they would see it, are taking the war now to Russia. And what's interesting to me is the extent to which Putin is feeling that. We hear that he is taking further support from North Korea. It's hard to get to the bottom of that, but he's doing that, if he is doing that, through desperation. And I think there must be huge pressure starting to mount on Putin. The economic implications, the oil shortages, which were very prevalent in the Crimea and now across parts of Russia, not because of a shortage of oil, but because of the attacks by drone strikes from Ukrainians on oil refineries and so on. It must be huge pressure. And I think, you know, we think back to Donald Trump saying he would sort this out in a week or a day or whatever it was, the nonsense of that. I think the best hope we have just now is if a construct can be developed which allows Putin to come out of this war, and by whichever face-saving way that he probably wants to have. And I think if the pressure can continue to be mounted by the incredible defence that Ukraine has put up, and by the way that they're developing, they're now perhaps the preeminent armed force in the whole of Europe. And they are just incredibly innovative. I know it's a bit worrying to talk about war in these terms, but they've had to be extremely innovative, and they're now extremely effective. And I think Europe genuinely owes them a huge debt of gratitude and every support that we can offer them in order to stop what Putin is up to. And it may well be that the balance is shortly going to tip in favour of Russia having to, or Putin in particular, having to reconsider his position.
And William, do you think that Scotland has lessons to learn from potentially trying to be an independent country within Europe, but with all these threats from, supposed threats from larger neighbours, in this case, not so much Russia being a neighbour, but through the open channels of the North Sea, we are still quite vulnerable in many ways, particularly when we hold strategic assets like oil and gas.
I think defence will be an important, how we conduct defence will be an important part of being an independent Scotland. And certainly there's much to learn from the likes of Ukraine about how they can be very much, if you like, the underdog and yet have the resilience. But I think Scotland as an independent country will have to be, not just in terms of defence, but in terms of how it conducts itself and its investment in its business. It's going to have to be innovative because we're going to be building from a relatively small base back to, I think, what we could be. And I think that's going to require a fair bit of cleverness about how we go about things. And Ukraine certainly has a lot to teach us about that. I would just say one thing that worries me about the current situation with Ukraine, and that is its present inability to actually defend the rocket attacks that Putin is launching, possibly as a last-ditch attempt to destabilize the place. And they really need to have the wherewithal to intercept more of these, and that's not currently happening. That's the one thing that worries me about the current, otherwise seeming change in the balance of the whole conflict.
Who are you suggesting needs to step up to the plate then in terms of giving Ukraine the technology?
It's Ukraine's European allies, and if they seem to be the ones in the best position, I would have thought. Keith may know more about this than I do, to supply what's needed to defend. And I'm not quite sure what the hold up is, but it certainly is a deficiency that is potentially maybe going to cost them dear.
Yeah. So Keith, do you think there is issues there for European allies as opposed to NATO, which would include therefore the USA and other countries like Canada?
There is, and I think there is about to be, and there's currently a nascent redrawing of the balance of power in Europe. We've seen Germany taking a much more proactive role. We've seen Baltic states, which traditionally shunned NATO, joining NATO, and they've done that for a very good reason. We've seen preparatory work undertaken in the Scandinavian states like Sweden and so on, but the Baltic states in a high state of readiness because they don't trust Putin, and they're right not to trust Putin. And if Scotland steps into that environment, I think, as William says, we have a very low base, but that doesn't mean to say that's where we should stay. We should, in my view, and my party has many pacifists in it, I'm not a pacifist, but in my view, Scotland should play a full role in that. And it may well be that its membership of NATO, and my party stands for membership of NATO, means that we have to develop niche capabilities, perhaps in relation to anti-piracy operations or other such things. But Scotland, in my view, should play a full part in NATO, regardless of what the US's approach is to NATO, in order to ensure the security of Western Europe.
Thank you. Moving on, in the wee smart hours of Friday, the Reform UK leader Nigel Farage was re-elected as MP for Clacton, with an increased share of the vote, but on a greatly reduced turnout. The Parliamentary Standards Commissioner has recommenced its inquiry into his £5 million gift from the British Thai cryptocurrency investor Christopher Harborne prior to the 2024 elections, which he didn't declare in shows of interest as required of an MP. William, if I may, Farage appeared to try a David Davis and seek another mandate from his constituents. Has this worked for him?
Well, I suppose he's got his mandate and he's back in Parliament, but he's just back where he started because the inquiry has begun again. And I suspect he's done himself a wee bit of damage in the course of the campaign. The vote for him did hold up, despite the increased turnout. The actual number of votes he got, and Reform will claim that that's a reasonable result. But it wasn't a meaningful electoral contest in any sense, because no other party of the main parties, apart from the Count Binface party, stood. And so you can't really draw any conclusions about how Reform, or indeed Farage, would have done against those other parties. And now, really, there is the threat, as there always was for Farage, of a recall mechanism coming into action if the parliamentary investigation so decides. And in the meantime, I think he's done some damage to himself as a man of the people, not least by not showing up for the count, ostensibly because Essex Police warned him there was going to be some disruption, something Essex Police have said they didn't do for him or for any other candidate. So it hasn't been a great spectacle, apart from the comedy input of Count Binface, and it leaves Farage much where he was. So I don't think he's achieved his goals at all.
Keith, do you think that this kind of circus taking place in Clacton will have any impact on Reform within Scotland?
No, I think the impact on reform in Scotland will be to do with the, if you like, deterioration in the standing of Nigel Farage through all these things which William has just mentioned. The parliamentary inquiry is not going to stop because he's pulled a stunt of a by-election. I do think, though, there's a real damage to democracy, maybe in a small way, but both this and the Makerfield by-election, where by-elections are created because of the individual whims of politicians, just shows a contempt for the electorate. And I do remember back in the 80s when Bruce Milan was newly elected as MP for Govan and decided to go off and take a job as a European Commissioner. And many people think the subsequent win for the SNP was partly due to the electorate just feel they were being used. They've stood for that job and then they've gone off. And similarly in Makerfield, people were used as a stepping stone for Andy Burnham's ambitions. In this case, Farage tried to use it to try and get out from under now a series of investigations and a real impact on his standing. We're seeing reform dropping in the polls. I would say that in Scotland, as you asked, Grant, I think the fortunes of Reform Scotland can always dip faster than the rest of the UK. It depends how bad they are in the Parliament, but I think they're very much tied into the individual standing of Farage, and I think he's taken a real hit and will continue to do so during the course of this investigation.
Also on Friday, we learned of the tragic and shocking news that came from London, where Professor Jason Arday, a former Cambridge academic and sociologist, was found dead at the age of 41. Police confirmed that officers responding to an ambulance call in Battersea on Friday afternoon discovered Professor Arday unresponsive. His death is currently being treated as unexpected but not suspicious. The news comes just over a week after Professor Arday stepped down from his post following intense public scrutiny over his academic work, biography and doctoral thesis. In his resignation statement last week, he spoke of the profound personal toll exacted by the relentless public commentary. Tributes have poured down from political leaders, academic colleagues and his family, the latter condemning what they described as a sustained and malicious campaign of abuse. As questions mount across the higher education sector and the media regarding the intense pressure modern public figures face, let's look at the wider implications of this tragic event. William, in the wake of Professor Arday's resignation and subsequent death, where is the line between legitimate academic or journalistic investigation into public figures and a modern digital pile-on that overwhelms an individual's welfare?
Well, there certainly has to be a line, and I think it's been crossed on this occasion and possibly also in previous occasions. Clearly, there was a story here, but I think it could have been handled probably by Cambridge University much better to avoid it being quite such a press pylon as it turned into. And a lot of that, of course, was connected to racism. I think that's fairly clear, and many of Jason Arday's friends and colleagues would respond in the same way to it. So the sad thing is that for this sort of thing, and you know, you can look back to even things like the Love Island scandal and the death of Caroline Flack and some other contestants before her, as a result, very likely, of media scrutiny. The fact is that the institutional response to these things always tends to follow the tragedy rather than when concerns are first being raised. So the response to Jason Arday when the concerns were first being raised could have been, I think, dealt with in a much better way. That there is something there that needed to be looked at, but it doesn't need to be looked at in the full glare of public scrutiny with his picture on the news every night and the implication that he's a fantasist in all sorts of ways. He may well be somebody where a different approach would have helped. I think possibly he may have been a plagiarist. He may also have been claiming certain other things that weren't the case. But that doesn't carry the penalty of what he faced, and it certainly shouldn't lead to his untimely death in the way that it has. So I think we need to look at, yes, how we look at these things and maybe try and build in some safeguards for the future so that we don't do this again, so we don't see this kind of reaction to another story 2 years down the line. Because what we've got now seems to me to be just occasionally out of control in quite a frightening way. And, if it's one person today, it could be somebody or it could be you tomorrow. And I don't like that at all.
And Keith, you have a university within your constituency. We sit in the grounds of the University of Stirling. How do you think universities are grappling with how to balance this institutional protection with rigorous academic standards and the intensive spotlight placed on high-profile appointments, particularly those breaking historic barriers? It's come to light that, in particular, one of the Cambridge academics who has since left or was sacked by Cambridge was a race realist, and actually was the one who stirred up a lot of internally some of the issues around what he saw as troubling with Professor Arday, but in actual fact has been proven to be unfounded now. How do we cope with these pressures within the higher education sector? What's our expectations?
Well, I think I don't know much about the individual details, and I know that Professor Arday also worked at Glasgow University previously, but I don't know too much of his background. What I have read is some of the reaction to those that his nearest and dearest has been over the last few days when he's been going through this, whatever else has happened, an incredible trauma. And to feel the weight of what William quite rightly called that press pylon is beyond most people's tolerance. It's just absolutely destructive of the human spirit. And I think Karen Flack's a good example, but talking about universities, the number of suicides we've seen over many years in universities, and Stirling University has not been immune from that, neither has my old university in Dundee. Because of the pressures, also things like sextortion, so young people feeling there's no way out for them after being threatened with having various things revealed to the wider public, and most importantly to them, usually their friends and family. So the pressures are absolutely enormous, and I think universities have to be aware of that. They've been aware of this for many years in terms of student welfare, and they've taken measures in relation to that. But they similarly have to be aware in terms of staff as well, and appointments, especially if it's a groundbreaking appointment. I should mention that Professor Arday's family are, it's sure, and he had said to them that there was nothing to the allegations that had been made, which would make this an even greater tragedy, of course. And there is nothing wrong in terms of press, investigative journalism, looking at issues of genuine public interest. And if that was to mean plagiarism or some other transgression, nothing wrong with that investigation. But we really have to have an idea in these post-COVID times about people's mental health if they suddenly get the laser-like focus of the entire public media on them and the impact it will have on them and their family. And I don't know how you resolve that. It may be something, hopefully we can, as we move away from post-COVID, I think it accounts for a great deal of atomization and isolation in society, if you can move away from that. But it really does require those who wield that kind of power in the media to be very conscious of its effects.
Andy Burnham has kind of suggested that perhaps there's a need to revisit the Leveson inquiry recommendations, which immediately has print media in particular up in arms about the freedom of the press. William, do you think that some of that is just the flack that we would expect from media owners not looking for any further regulation around how and what they report on? Or is there actually genuine concerns here about trying to limit freedom of speech?
I think we've always got to keep a road open for freedom of speech, but I don't think that the press can reasonably complain about the reaction to this being. Let's look at Leveson, which was itself a huge thing, which drew in a number of people, and indeed they'd been monstering a number of people and harassing them, and that was totally unacceptable, and it was quite right that the Leveson inquiry should have taken place, but it clearly hasn't fixed the underlying problem. And freedom of speech is important, but the freedom to do the media pylon and to harass somebody to their death, as seems to have happened there, we don't absolutely know for sure if there was a causal link, but it looks very much like it. That's well beyond the pale, and I think it would be unreasonable to protest too much. And I wouldn't expect that to have any legs. And I would hope that something is done to try at least to get some of the fix in before the next issue happens, rather than afterwards when it's actually too late for the poor person concerned.
Yeah, and Keith, the what's also been, what we've really been talking about is about what media will say, but in particular how the digital public sphere will amplify much of that kind of news reporting. There is this suggestion that because it was politically motivated from this kind of anti-wokeism amongst some people towards progressive, whether DEI initiatives, that was seen as the kind of fanfare around Professor Arday being made the youngest black professor at Cambridge. And then aligned to, let's face it, in the UK, media ownership predominantly being right of centre, if not right wing. Is there a collusion taking place, perhaps, in the right of the United Kingdom towards copying some of the worst excesses of the alt-right of the United States, infiltrating into UK media, coming into our own body politic? Is this irrational in my mind?
Well, there is a direct link between what we've learned of this week. Money is pouring into not just the UK, but to Europe from American government now, which is promoting these things under different guises, anti-immigration guises and so on. So I think the idea that one might follow the other, it's hard to know where it started, is not at all unrealistic. However, I think you touched on an important point, Grant, in relation to ownership. It's not just that the ownership of the print media, and you're right to say the print media has a limited impact, but that is massively amplified when it gets into the wider digital media. But the print media is now such a concentrated and overseas, non-UK ownership, that in the past years, past decades, people would have thought this is just, companies that would have owned it were by and large based in the UK or individual owners. But now it's so concentrated and it is of so much. The media, to me, the thing that surprises me is they don't realise there must be a huge commercial opportunity from straying from the usual right-wing, anti-woke, with all the other things that go with it, agenda, because there's an appetite for that. And everyone trying to push the same kind of stuff. And people obviously don't believe it in many cases. If I look at my own political party, I mean, virtually every media organisation, print and otherwise, was not for the SNP, despite which they managed to win an incredible fifth election victory, which, looked at from the rest of Europe, is just a stunning achievement. You wouldn't believe that if you happen to read the print media here in Scotland. But there must be an opportunity for a more diverse agenda being pursued across the print and digital media, in my view, and that would be a healthy thing to see.
Thank you. Last month, First Minister John Swinney called for Andy Burnham to U-turn on what he called the sabotage of Scotland's industrial future, a reference to the UK government's decision to deny a 1.5 billion investment to build the UK's largest wind turbine factory in the Highlands on the grounds it was against the national interest. Yet the UK government has approved a series of Chinese-backed projects south of the border, including nuclear plants, a super embassy, Heathrow Airport expansion, as well as investment in English power networks and battery sites. On Friday, the local MSP and MP for the proposed site in the Highlands, Emma Roddick and Graham Leadbetter, demanded a U-turn on the decision. Turning to you, William, will the UK government take heed and reverse its decision, do you think?
I don't know that they will, but you never know. With Andy Burnham perhaps wanting to differentiate himself in some way, it's not entirely incomprehensible that the decision has been taken. It's the first real, if you like, the starting point project that's been blocked from the outset under the National Security and Investment Act of 2021. That act has sort of spread its tentacles into some other things. So some of the nuclear investments in England, for example, have been cancelled or have been nationalised in such a way as to exclude the Chinese influence. So it's possible that we might get back to something approaching David Cameron's golden age, where we're much more accepting of Chinese investment. But there do seem to be the security issues, and I'm not an expert in these things, so I'm not really clear on how real they actually are. But certainly, the legislation that's been passed means that these things in sensitive areas, such as energy infrastructure and telecommunications, etc., get a particular scrutiny. And that's what seems to have happened in this case. But the price for Scotland is that we lose out on quite a number of jobs, for one thing, and possibly other jobs further down the pipeline in the supply chain. We potentially lose a manufacturing gap in that there's a part of the wind turbine, the nacelle, which is a key part in terms of housing all the interesting stuff in it that runs it basically, and also allows it to turn the right direction in the wind. We at the present time have to import these. It is possible that there's another potential investment by Vestas, a smaller one, in Scotland, that might manufacture these items rather than forcing us to import them. So we're losing out on that. And of course, the irony is too that what will probably happen if we don't have the capacity to manufacture them is that we will be buying them in anyway. They may be full of the Chinese technology that may either be spying on us in some perhaps unforeseen way, or give them the ability to switch the things off should that prove strategic in some future conflict or disagreement. So it seems to me that it's Scotland getting the rough end once again of the legislation that's being passed, and maybe there needs to be a wee bit more thought about how it's applied and more of a cost-benefit balance. But whether Andy Burnham will do that, I do not know. Maybe Keith has an inside line. I doubt it, though.
Well, just got to turn you to Keith. Do you think Scotland's receiving a clear differential treatment over industrial policies, similar to the way that Grangemouth was closed whilst investing in new plants south of the border? What's the political angle for the Labour Party in particular in the UK government, given Scotland such a raw deal?
It's hard to work out, Grant, to be honest. And I like William, have no insight as to what Andy Burnham will do. You have to go based on the past track record, and I don't see any change happening because of that. But you're right to draw parallels with the different treatment that we've had in Grangemouth. The slowness of any assistance for Grangemouth, the absence of any urgency, as we've seen displayed in places in England and Wales when there have been major industrial closures. And in relation to this, the things that occur to people who, like most of us, don't have the inside track is, why did they agree to a massive super embassy, Chinese embassy in London? Why have they agreed, notwithstanding what William rightly says about some of the Chinese nuclear investment, to still have China involved in nuclear projects? And the simple point is, again, Scotland has got the energy, but we don't have the power. We don't have the power not even to take the decision as to whether to take that risk and insulate any risks there might be. I think that project is now destined to go to the Netherlands. I could be wrong in that. But not even having the power to take that decision, knowing the risks and able to mitigate them. But we don't even get to see what the rationale was for Scotland being treated in this way. And it's no small thing. 1,500 jobs, really good jobs in that part of the country would be a massive benefit to Scotland. And I just think we have, in one sense, a UK government which, like all previous UK governments, is insufficiently concerned about the situation in Scotland and antipathetic towards it in many areas as well. I can't see any other reason for it, but it's worth saying in the passing that the performance of the Labour government since being elected in 2024 on energy and renewable energy has been pathetic. We expected so much more after the change of government in terms of renewable support and so on, carbon capture, and they have done nothing. It's an absolute disaster. So maybe it's of a piece with that kind of antipathy towards Scotland or lack of interest in it. But at the very least, the Scottish Government should be taken into the conference by the UK Government. Let them explain why they think it's important for security reasons that this shouldn't happen. The Scottish Government, over the entire 10 years I was in it, and right through since 2007, has never betrayed a single confidence given to them by the UK Government, including market-sensitive information and so on as well. So at the very least, they should be taken into the conference of the UK Government when they try to explain why they said no to this project.
So can we expect maybe an SNP or a Yes-led campaign to exploit this industrial mistreatment that's taking place within Scotland?
I mean, I know I've signed off quite a number of press releases. I know that Believe in Scotland have taken a cracking campaign on energy. So you're seeing a lot of activity just now. And I think energy is because, we were told Labour were going to cut bills by 300. They've gone up by nearly that much. An absolute fiasco in terms of energy. So I don't think the political involvement in it's going to abate. But I do think that idea, and it's a bit like, in the 70s it's Scotland's oil. Well, now it's Scotland's energy, but we're not getting the power to properly deal with it. And in fact, we're penalised by having to pay higher rates than the rest of the UK to tap into the grid, which Ed Miliband had a temerity to try and suggest we should change and make it fairer. And look what happened to him.
And William, do you think activists for the independence campaign would be ready to take to the streets on issues like this?
I take my hat off to Believe in Scotland. They're doing a great amount of work, and particularly on items like energy, as well as Scotland's right to choose. Right now, I think they're the main hope of the independence movement in terms of getting people out in the streets to protest about things. Personally, I would much rather that the independence movement as a whole recovered some of its mojo and started to look at things specifically which Scotland is suffering from, that we feel we could do better, or at least have a chance of doing better under independence, and be much more voluble about it. But the movement currently is very slightly in the doldrums, and there are people trying to fix that and to bring it back to where it was. Believe in Scotland are the leading voices on there, and more power to them. But we need a lot more in the campaign, and looking at specific issues just like this, really to get the blood of the Scottish people up again, and the people who aren't part of the movement to understand that there is an argument to be had here and that it's worth winning. So I don't think we're quite there yet with the movement, but I very much hope that the next 12 months sees a big increase in energy and activity, because we can't allow things to go on like this. We simply can't.
Yep, and similarly economically, on Wednesday, the Government Expenditure and Revenue Scotland report for 2025-26 was published. According to GERS, Scotland's net fiscal balance is estimated to have improved by 0.6 billion. This net fiscal balance is a notional figure. It measures the difference between revenue raised in Scotland compared with the expenditure on behalf of the Scottish people. Let's cut to the chase, William. Is Scotland looking economically better, do you think, under these figures? Could this be part of a harbinger for independence itself?
I'm on the side of the argument that says the figures are largely irrelevant, because they don't really tell you anything worthwhile about, well, they tell you nothing worthwhile about Scotland as it might be as an independent country, nor do they tell you particularly much about how Scotland is doing now, when so much of what goes into the GERS figures stems from decisions made elsewhere or things which are beyond the Scottish Government's control. So it's good to see that there's an improvement, and it's good to see that the improvement comes partially from something the Scottish Government did, which is to freeze the tax rates, which didn't go down at all well with higher rate taxpayers. And it was thought that actually it would be counterproductive. Well, it doesn't look like it was counterproductive. It looks as if it's actually brought more money in. The other thing that has increased the revenues has been a Westminster decision about employers' national insurance contributions. So that's where the plus comes in. Expenditure, most of which is not carried out by Scotland, but is carried out on Scotland's behalf, on reserved matters and all manner of things. It tells us nothing about how Scotland's actually getting on. I think if we become independent tomorrow, there's a lot of work to be done, but there's a great deal of potential. And I think maybe the GERS figures hint at that potential in certain aspects of them, but that's as far as I would go with it. I'm very much in the this is irrelevant, and it's like a parade every year of these figures with the two entrenched sides saying what they always say about them, and we need to move on from that.
Keith, following on from what William just said, why does the Scottish Government bother publishing these statistics when it was originally designed as a Tory propaganda stunt by Ian Lang when he was Secretary of State?
Well, many of the figures which comprise GERS are figures which the Scottish Government is responsible for collecting. And I don't deny that they are accurate in as far as they go, although when you look into some of them, they're based on survey information, which could be questioned. And of course, to stop producing these figures immediately would lead to accusations that you're hiding something when this is publicly available information. I think the much more important point, and I agree with William, that they're not completely irrelevant. They do tell us something about the effects of the tax changes which Scotland has introduced, which of course we were told were going to result in thousands of people leaving Scotland, and actually the reverse is true. But they're relevant when you consider the bigger picture, which is that the UK, and we don't acknowledge this enough, or it's not widely enough known, the UK is £3 trillion in debt. Brexit is costing us tens and tens of billions of pounds every year across the UK. We've had 15 years of austerity, which has denuded nearly all of our public services. There is no prospect, according to whatever Labour or Tories propose, of that changing fundamentally. They accept the fiscal rules which are there. So we are doomed to be part of this much more unequal, uneven society with wage suppression, higher cost of living. And that's the future of the UK, which is not going to change. So I think the much more important thing is to get across through, as William says, hopefully, and I've got a lot of hope this will happen, a meeting of our NEC yesterday and a meeting of the National Assembly next Saturday. This is central to what we're discussing, how we move forward from where we are now. Hopefully people can become aware of Scotland's got to have much greater potential than that. I mean, just look across the Irish Sea to Ireland, wrestling with budget surpluses, growth figures which dwarf the UK. So the potential certainly there, the examples of how to realise that potential are there. And in that sense, to see the orgy of negativism which comes every time these figures are produced by people that are meant to represent Scotland, saying how terrible Scotland is, it's a disaster, it's an economic basket case based on nothing at all, because as William rightly says, these tell us nothing about an independent Scotland. They do tell us a little bit about how Scotland fares under a union whereby we spend more on the debt interest that the country owes than we do to defence and possibly even health. I don't know exactly the figure, but massive amounts of money squandered on things like that. And to me, although many governments in the past will be responsible for that, there are none more responsible than the Tory government that got chucked out in 2024. They caused Brexit. They stuck with austerity when no one else stuck with that. They squandered tens of billions of pounds in their response to COVID. And now Labour has accepted all of that, and they're getting, I'm sure there are people in the Labour Party, as there definitely are in the Scottish government, would like to see improved public services, improved budgets, but they're stuck with where the UK is and where it wants to be, and that's not a future for Scotland.
Is there a case for, at the time of GERS report coming out, a view on how perhaps an independent Scotland would look financially, similar to what was put into the original white paper for the 2014 independence referendum and then updated annually? Is that something that the Scottish Government are able to do, Keith?
Well, I've always argued within the party, as yet unsuccessfully, that we should do something around the UK budget, which does something like that, which shows what Scotland's position actually is, taking into account the reserve functions as well. And I think showing what we currently have to cope with in terms of interest, debt payments, many things we wouldn't want to be paying for at all, whether it's nuclear weapons or otherwise. So I think around that time, I think doing it simply as a response or alternative to GERS is given GERS a significance it doesn't really have. But I think doing it around the UK budget, which tells a much truer picture of how Scotland's held back, to me that would be a better time to do it.
William, would you agree with what Keith just said? Is there a need to continually put the economic case for independence on the front foot rather than relying on these limited official reports that actually don't really tell us a huge amount?
Yeah, I don't think we should always be in response mode. If it were feasible, and it needn't be a response to GERS, but it could be done at another time, as Keith suggests, I hadn't really considered that. But if it could be feasibly done to present figures that actually give a more realistic picture of both Scotland's position now and its potential, and put the positive gloss on that which is justified, then I would be all behind it. But I have a feeling, and I know that Keith has been trying to get this done within the party, and so far unsuccessfully were the words that stood out for me, because it has been mooted now for many years that we should have some sort of, not GERS response necessarily, but something that where we're effectively standing up for ourselves rather than having to respond and always being on the back foot. One obvious thing that strikes me about GERS is there isn't a direct comparison to GERS in the rest of the UK, not something that's an official, for example, Welsh government publication, although there is a GERW that's independently produced. And there are similar figures for the English regions and indeed for Northern Ireland. And funnily enough, I believe if you were to scrutinise them, you would see that every single part of the UK is in deficit except for London, the southeast and the east of England. Everybody else, the north of England in deficit. Northern Ireland has the worst figures, apparently, if worst is the right word to be using. Wales is worse than Scotland. Scotland, actually, it's far from the most extreme. It's probably better than the north of England as well. So if you look at it in that sort of way, it indicates that we must be doing some things right. And yes, if we could find a way of broadcasting that and getting it out to people rather than having it smothered by the media, which is also a problem, then that would be very valuable. And it might just give the general public a wee bit more of an impression that Scotland might be something that could go places and give the independence movement something to work with.
On Tuesday, Keith, you reminded Prime Minister Andy Burnham that independence is not, as Burnham said, off limits, as yet another poll shows a continuing yes lead of 52%. Do you think he's listening to you?
No, I get the impression that when he talks about devolution, he's not even thinking about Scotland or Wales or Northern Ireland. It's about mayors and various things down south. He has given the assurance to the First Minister that any changes under devolution won't be carried out. I think it's put as above the heads of the Scottish Government, so at least we're going to be involved to some extent. But no, I don't think he is listening. And I think it's neither here nor there, really. We're never going to have a UK Prime Minister that's going to listen to the arguments that Scotland's got a right to decide its own future, for example. They, I think, are pretty much aware that the likelihood is that Scotland will choose to be independent, which could bring huge benefits to the rest of the UK as well, by the way. So I don't think he is listening to that extent. But the lesson from that is not to try and continually make him listen. The lesson is, what do we do about it? What do we do here in Scotland about it? So I proposed, and the SNP agreed with a proposal from John Swinney and myself, that we should have a constitutional convention, not on independence, on Scotland's right to decide. That is the key issue now, because within the independence movement, we can all build castles in the air about the kind of independent Scotland we'd like to see, and it's nothing wrong with having those aspirations or even dreams about how great an independent Scotland could be. But the purpose is to try and affect that change, and we have to affect it. There's no other way, in my view, than through a referendum, a proper referendum, where people decide in a majority that's what they want to do. So the focus has got to be on doing that, and to do that, we have to go beyond certainly the SNP and the Scottish Government and the Greens, and even those that support independence, which is currently around 50%, to those who believe in Scotland, that we should have that right to decide. And I remember when Ian Blackford led the walkout of MPs at Westminster, the SNP put on 7,000 new members. And I went out to meet a demonstration, an ad hoc demonstration outside the Scottish Parliament, and talked to a number of people, many of whom had never joined a political party before, but they were just so angered about the treatment of Scotland. So to me, it's about what we do, and perhaps continually trying to convince Andy Burnham or a Labour government in London to listen is going to produce less results than if we get on with it ourselves and force the issue.
William, just taking forward what Keith said there about how successful the Blackford walkout was, do we need something bigger? Should the SNP and any other independent supporting party perhaps have abstained from Westminster in order to get that point across? Or is this futile politics?
An abstention from Westminster with the current numbers wouldn't be as effective as it might once have been, to be fair. But I think I would be all for political figures standing up. And yes, in particular for Scotland's right to decide, because what right-thinking Scot can actually disagree with Scotland's right to decide its own future? What possible argument could you have against that? We need to build something that gives us a conceit of ourselves, and that is exactly the sort of thing I would want from the convention that Keith is talking about, and we've been hoping for that sort of thing for quite some time. So if that is in the pipeline, that would be very good and very interesting to know. And yes, I think it should be focusing on right to decide as what we should be talking about there. And there's much to be said.
Well, it certainly has the appeal of the Constitutional Convention of the early 90s, in which the Claim of Right became a principal document that was more substantive than any one member of the Constitutional Convention and what they believed, because it had a kind of wider constitutional principle. Who would we want to see take part in that type of constitutional convention, William? Is it only going to be independent supporters? How do you attract other people into that type of body now?
Well, if you're talking about Scotland's right to decide, you should get more than independent supporters. I think we should cast the net as widely as possible. I don't know who the main figures would be, but I would like to have a way of consulting as much of the public as could possibly be consulted and involve them as much as possible. How you do that without it becoming a huge, massive thing, I don't know. But I don't think there's any point in the independence movement simply talking to itself. We have to convince other people, not only that, yeah, we do have the right to decide, but that there is a point in deciding for independence. We need to be in dialogue with them. At the minute, we're not in dialogue, not nearly to the extent that we should be. And so, yeah, I'm open to anything that we can do that moves us out of the rut that we currently seem to be in terms of moving this debate forward.
And if I can, in my last minute on this segment, Keith, can I ask you just to clarify, who do you see going into that Constitutional Convention this time?
Well, I was responsible for this before the election. Since the election, the First Minister has taken this into government, which I think is quite right. If you think about the last time we really started moving forward on independence is when the Scottish Government back in 2011 and 12 took things forward. So I think he's right. But what I did before the election was talking to the Greens, the STUC, churches, other groups in Civic Scotland, other figures in Civic Scotland. And William's absolutely right. There is no point in us just creating another independence convention. Independence work has to go on, which will go on. The SNP, the Greens, Believe in Scotland and others. But this is about Scotland's right to decide. And I think it should be led by Civic Scotland. And you're right, Grant, to talk about the 1990s convention. We shouldn't be too proud to not take lessons from that. And now I think international speakers, international figures coming to Scotland, demonstrations, marches, petitions, starting off with all elected members that believe in Scotland's right to decide. There's all sorts of things. Internationally, I'm off to a meeting in Galway in September. I'll be meeting with Welsh and Northern Irish and Irish counterparts. Those kind of discussions have to continue because international legitimacy and international pressure to observe the democratic norm of Scotland's right to decide are extremely important as well. So something as broad-based and as building as that, and it's much more difficult for a UK government to keep on saying no. It can say no, you're just the SNP, you're just the Scottish Government, you're just the independent majority in a Scottish Parliament. But when it's a broad-based Civic Scotland speaking as one voice, nobody can withstand that, in my view.
Great. Thank you very much, both of you, Keith and William. We're going to end this week's show with a look at what's happening in Edinburgh. It's the first week of the 3 weeks of the festival, and I was through on Monday for a play and a puppet show with a very, very dark difference. Broadcasting Scotland has seen a number of shows we would recommend, including Boogie on the Bone at Summer Hall, Lawrence of Arabia and Me at Surgeons Hall, You Never Know at Surgeons Hall, and Atomic Tales at Zoo Playground. We have an interview with Elena from Atomic Tales, which we'll play at the end of the programme. The city is buzzing with visitors, and the only clouds appear when people like the council leader, Jenny Mayer, has a go at the Scottish Government for only giving $5 million following the fire at Debenham store in Princes Street. It's causing a bit of traffic chaos there. But we'll look on the bright side, and as I said, we'll show a bit of a clip with Elena, who has been producing a show at the Edinburgh Fringe. I just want to say thank you very much for watching Fully Scottish. For our guests, Keith, Brian, William Duguid. Hope to see you again sometime. It's good afternoon from us at Broadcasting Scotland.
Bye.
Our show is Atomic Tales, and my name is Elena Arvigo, and this is an independent theatre project. This solo show comes from Prayer for Chernobyl from Svetlana Alexievich, who won a Nobel Prize about 10 years ago, and is a part of a project that I have in Italy called The Unforgivables, about women and war. This was one of the first shows about 12 years ago, I Monologhi dell'Atomica, and the first one was about Anna Politkovskaya. And we had really many rounds in Italy, like more than 355 or something like that, and we won very important awards. And I thought that was interesting to see what's the urge to say a story. What if I go somewhere else, like at the Fringe in Edinburgh, for example, and not without a proper translation? You know, that's the risk, because to come here, I wanted to have like a challenge, not just to bring a show here. I wanted to have a little challenge on theater, because, you know, after so many years, it's 30 years I'm in this job. I'm an actress and director in my country. I'm very interested in the things that make people calm, and the borders, the boundaries between audience and stage, what's to be on stage, and how a show is made by actors and audience. Always, you cannot do it without them, and it's always different. So what's the urge to say? And it's wonderful. I have to say that it's such a precious experience, because it makes me, it reminds me of why I love so much this job, because it's about people. And this show speaks about, sorry, il mio inglese è sempre così. I lived in London for 5 years, and I was at Goldsmith University. Nobody would believe this. I always, because I got very emotional, and so I don't remember anymore anything. But why not? Why not? At one point I say, we share silence. I will not say this in any language. We'll just share some silence. And that's so important. Not just words. Just to share that magic something for which we like so much, to go to see things alive, music, theater, and they will never die, even in these strange, stupid days, because it's about people there in presence. Come!